Hello, hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm Simon Cook, one of the directors at Zeta, and I'm joined today by Giles Green for our webinar discussing the current Legionella compliance landscape following the issue of the revised ACOP and HSG274 guidance. The intention is about 40 minutes of chat. We can keep that going to about 1 o'clock if your questions keep coming through. If you do have to leave at all, because we are recording this and you will get a link to that after the webinar. Firstly, just a few technical words. You can chat and ask questions using the Q&A tab in the bottom left of your screen. Failing that, you can email Megan Hope, which is mhope@zetaplc.com. Don't worry, nobody else can see what you're asking. We will try and cover some of the questions today, but if not, we can follow those up with you individually. If you've got any pop-up info bars on your screen, like the yellow one that you can hopefully see now, you can close that or minimize that. And your best view is presentation view, which is the little person icon, which should be in the bottom left. So firstly, just let me introduce Giles to you. So Giles is the chairman of the technical committee of the Water Management Society. He's a director of the Legionella Control Association and also sits on their governing committee. Often acts as an expert witness, co-authored British Standard BS 8580 for Legionella risk assessment, and he was also part of the technical group that actually authored the new HSG 274 guidance. Perhaps to start off, Giles, just tell us a little bit about your involvement in that.
Yes, indeed. Good morning, everybody, or strictly speaking, good afternoon. Yes, I was invited to join that group actually before the Health and Safety Executive got involved. It's something the Water Management Society and a couple of other groups got involved in first of all. Then the Health and Safety Executive joined and it became their document, but there was a very substantial input from the sector, from the technical sector, as well as the enforcing authority. So it is very much a document from the users rather than from the enforcers, although of course they had ultimately the editorial control. So it should be right for all sectors.
Excellent. Okay, well, a couple of topics we wanted to cover today. So firstly, we were going to start off really with some learning points from the HSE enforcement campaign, specifically around cooling towers. Probably spend about 10, maybe 15 minutes on that. Then move on to key changes to the HSG 274 Part 2, which is specifically around hot and cold water guidance. So the first point on cooling towers, I think, is about access, which might seem a strange place to start. So what's that got to do with Legionella, Giles?
Interesting one, this. I think it touches on something which we so easily, this trap we so easily fall into. We attend a site, we look at a specific risk, we look at the Legionella risk, we're concerned in getting that in every detail, we focus on the thing we went there to study. And we walk past other things which are perhaps as dangerous. Now, this is something the Health and Safety Executive, of course, don't do. Health and Safety Executive will look more broadly. When they set out, they had their own ideas. They had a study carried out by their laboratory, the Health and Safety Executive Laboratory, which came out in a report in 2012. Called HEX 1207, and they looked at 44 outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease over the 10 years to August 2011. Now there were 44 of those, and they were able to include 17 in an analysis of the causes. And what emerged from that was, very interestingly, a pattern. Hello, I've gone the wrong way with the slides. Beg your pardon. What emerged from that, rather interestingly, was some common causes. Scheme of control was a big feature. A risk assessment was a big feature. training and competence was a big feature, and finally implementation. And when we look at what they found in their enforcement campaign, which you can see on your screens there, much the same things popped up, but surprisingly access headed the list. This is curious. The very first myth of the month the Health and Safety Executive put on their website back in 2007 was on the banning of ladders. You can see the little cartoon they posted. The Health and Safety Executives banned step ladders. And they make the point, no, they haven't. They make the point a step ladder is a perfectly safe way to carry out an inspection or a simple task. And they ended up by saying, yes, you can do this. No, we haven't banned them. And yet, in their campaign, many of the improvement notices which they served and several of the prohibition notices were concerned with inadequate access. Now, I had assumed if you serve a prohibition notice, my understanding of it was it prohibited a practice. For example, an unguarded machine, switch off that machine until it is guarded. And I would have thought with a prohibition notice for access to a cooling tower, it would prohibit the activity of gaining access. So you can't get to look, for example, at the drift eliminators. Don't go up there. But no. If you can't safely inspect the drift eliminators, the prohibition notice can apply and stop you running your cooling tower. And there were several examples where there was no access to inspect the drift eliminators, to set up or adjust the dosing pumps. And the prohibition notice said, you can't run this system safely because you don't have a safe practice, safe access, or a specific task. Shut the thing down. Stop using it.
Okay, well, that's an interesting finding, I think. The next point, I think, that came out of it was around risk assessments and inadequacy of risk assessments. So, Giles, what is or is not an adequate risk assessment?
This is another interesting one again. The Health and Safety Work Act is pretty strict. It places a duty on the employer, hence the term duty holder, because you're an employer, it places a duty, hands you a duty, you're holding it, to ensure that the activities of his business puts no one, that's his employees or anybody else, at risk. Now, at risk doesn't mean doing them any harm. It means taking a chance, putting them at risk of some harm, which is a very high standard to achieve. And it does create a little bit of an anomaly if you just try to apply the common sense analysis which we sometimes do to carry out risk assessment. Take the severity, put it in the context of the likelihood to give you the risk. So if it's very severe but unlikely, that's quite a risk. If it's very severe and likely, it's more a risk. But you've always got this sort of balance. A big one multiplied by a small one, or a small one multiplied by a big one gives you the answer. Trouble is, if you apply an arithmetic approach like that, you run into a problem when the severity is infinite and being dead is infinite. We've got something here which will kill you. If you get Legionnaire's disease, about 7 out of 8 people survive. But that statistic doesn't really give you the detail. It is a horrible disease, and many of the people who catch it suffer very, very badly, and even in the long term can be disabled by it. So it isn't just a simple numbers game. When you've got this severity multiplied by likelihood giving you an answer, it simply doesn't work when something is infinite. And now that's where you need to start to apply a bit of judgment. So you can look at this and say it's very serious but not very likely. But does that give you the whole story? There's another dimension. You've got to apply a bit of common sense, a bit of reason, a bit of thought. You've got really to say, this is a tool, and you've got to use it with intelligence, with discretion. You've really got to know how. You've got to understand. You've got to know how the thing, what it is telling you.
Yeah, and I think that probably leads into our next point, which is around the actual competency of the people operating cooling towers. So I'm sure all the people who are logged in to this webinar are experts in their own business activity and what they do, but I think some of the findings from the HC enforcement was seemingly not all expert in how to run the cooling tower properly. So perhaps you could just expand on that for a start.
Yeah, I think that's right. We all like to think we're good at our job, but there are always aspects of our job which are not what we choose to do. Perhaps the favourite thing we don't want to do is the paperwork. Many of us are very well able to do the job we're paid to do, but the peripherals, the odds and ends are such a pain. And this leads us on to, what do you do if you've got a business which requires some cooling, whether it's air conditioning, whether it's a process, you're in the business of making doodahs, and to make doodahs you've got to cool them down or they pour all over the floor. You've got to have a cooling system. And what has emerged over the entire time that Legionnaire's disease has been an issue is not willful, very often willful neglect to do the job properly, but ignorant neglect. People just don't understand the severity and how to do this. And this leads us on to this notion of competence. Training is not the same as competence. Ability is not the same as competence. Performance is not the same as competence. Competence is one of those things, it's kind of difficult to define. It's rather, I think, a bit like intelligence. You recognize it when you see it, and you recognize when it's missing. And sometimes you only find out one of those when it matters. There are several definitions, I believe, of competence in legislation. I've not looked up the one in the explosives in mines regulations, but there is one much more relevant in the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations of 1999, which is actually cited in the Approved Code of Practice L8. And a person should be regarded as competent where he has sufficient training and experience or knowledge and other qualities to enable him properly to undertake the measures referred to. So it really comes down to, have you got the training, the background, and the experience? Do you know how to do this? And have they all gone into a mind which then has the right attitude, the right experience, perspective to apply them intelligently? And this takes us back to this whole question of, how do you interpret a risk assessment? You've got to do it one way, and you've got to then look at the answer you get and decide, does that make sense? Or have you actually created something nonsensical from your algorithm?
Yeah, and I think probably that links into the final point about, so people have got to get a good risk assessment done. They need to be competent themselves in interpreting that, working with their provider. And probably that's the last point really around, a lot of good work going on and a great deal of money being spent on Legionella controls. But in terms of how effective that has been in the experience from the enforcement, and probably just linking generally into how well people are implementing those controls.
Well, I think perhaps the good news is that the majority of the inspections did not result in more than a friendly conversation, possibly a bit of friendly advice, and a genial parting of the ways. I think I'm right in saying something like 20% resulted in something a little bit more, some with, as I say, prohibition notices or improvement notices, and sometimes a letter saying you really should sharpen up in this respect or that. But what I think tends to happen, and it happens in so many of these cases, is that you find yourself as an operator, as anybody in the equation, including risk assessors, you get focused on the activity and lose sight of the strategy. And that's a very easy thing to do. I mentioned earlier on where you carry out a risk assessment, a Legionella risk assessment, walk straight past a big hole in the ground or a fire hazard or working at heights problem, an access problem. What I think you need to do is look at this in the round. You've got your risk assessment, which informs your scheme of control. So you look at your setup and say, well, we know how to treat a cooling tower, but this particular cooling tower, or this particular system, doesn't matter whether it's a cooling tower, has a special strength or a special weakness. So we adapt our scheme to fit that. And your scheme is only a wish list until you get up and do it. And so the scheme is then applied. And what you find is elements of it don't work very well, don't achieve what you want to, or can't be done the way you thought. So you adjust it. But then that's generating a wealth of information, these results. And from that you can, for example, tell how reliable your dosing and control kit is, whether something is automatic, can be relied on, or can't be. Sometimes things don't behave as you think. We've all seen systems which do odd things, you can't explain them. That then gets fed back into your next risk assessment or your risk assessment review, saying, well, we thought this was like this, but it behaves like that. So now we know something more. We can inform our next risk assessment, which informs our revised scheme. We implement that, feed the results back in. With a bit of luck, we've got the risk down. And this virtuous circle is created. And that, I think, is what was what the competent person sees. A less competent person blindly doesn't. He follows the procedure.
Okay, thanks, Giles. So about halfway through, so we'll move on to hot and cold water systems in a second. Probably time for just one question which we had submitted, which was from a client who says they operate a cooling tower near to a healthcare premises. In light of the enforcement and the new guidance, is it still reasonable to operate a cooling tower near to a healthcare premises?
Oh, how near. There is no such thing as too far or too near. We've revised the distance that a cooling tower, between a cooling tower and healthcare premises and other risks, in light of new information several times. I think the straightforward answer is yes, it is reasonable, provided you have done what you should be doing anyway, and that is you've got this risk assessment which has informed your scheme, you've implemented your controls, processed your records, your results, to bring your risk down. There is no doubt a properly run cooling system is safe. That's something that's been established over forever. The question of just how do you take account of it is recognized in your risk assessment that there is a higher susceptibility with healthcare premises. That's where people go when they're sick. And so they've really got to say, we've got a greater risk, let's up the game. Let's make things just a bit sharper. So we've got a decent dosing and control system in place, and we are, as the guidance says, checking it at suitable intervals. But if it should go adrift, maybe we should jump a bit more quickly.
Would you say that's a general message for cooling tower operators, post enforcement campaign, to up their game?
I don't think you can ever do any harm to up your game. If everybody upped their game, I think we would make these systems a lot safer. And I'm not going to bet we're not going to have another outbreak of Legionnaire's disease. I'd rather bet that we are, even though we've had this campaign, even though how to run this system safely has been there in the public domain for 25 years and more.
Okay, well, we'll move on to hot and cold water systems now. So the HSG274 Part 2 guidance came out in early April, and one of the key changes in there is around some of the guidance and strategy around managing circulating hot water systems. Charles?
Yes, that's right. These diagrams, which I've got here, we've taken from the guidance because the hot and cold water system, the circulating system, suddenly emerged in the revision as quite a big deal. If you remember, until HSG274 Part 2, a fast sentinel point was about as far away from the hot water calorifier as you could get. If you were wise, should we say competent, you'd look at the schematic diagram and say, although the system, although the furthest point physically may be here, the furthest point on the system may be somewhere else. But what it never ever took account of, because you just went to the tap and ran it, is the circuit literally flowing all the time, or is the circuit stationary and you run the tap and suck hot water to its destination? And what actually transpired was there are many systems where you don't have circulating water. So let's look at this system here. We've got a hot water cylinder here, hot water calorifier down here, fed from a cold water tank up there, conventional sort of thing. The water rises and it goes up here, turns around and comes back again. It also divides, goes up here, turns around and comes back again, up here, turns around and comes back again. So we've got 3 loops up and down the building. I've lost my pointer. Where's my pointer gone? Looking at this water system, is that working? Are you seeing the laser pointer? Right, I've got thumbs up. I'm pretending to be Simon Cook now. I apologise for that. He's got a better face for radio than I have, so you're probably better off now. We've got a hot water calorifier down here, fed by a cold water tank up here, usual sort of system, with the water flowing out and dividing, going up and down here, up and down here, and up and down here. So if we zoom in to this point here, we've got a new concept, and that is that the water is rising up here, and where we take our sentinel point is there on the return leg. So you can go to this tap here and run this and suck water up the flow leg to the tap and pass muster. But if there's a valve closed or that in that circuit, you could suck water up the return leg to there, or if it's simply not flowing up and over, you could draw water up there and still pass. Because it's not flowing, that downward leg there is cool or cold or warm or worse, and that could be a very, very substantial dead leg. We've looked at water systems over the years and fussed over 1 or 2 or 3 pipe diameters, and all the time in the panels, in the service voids and risers in our buildings, we've got return legs. It's effectively static. Dead legs could be tens of meters in length. And that's why this new sentinel point is defined on the return leg. And then, of course, in this, if you go back to this this diagram here, you can see the system isn't as simple as that. Not only does this one rise and fall, but at this point it loops to the building and back again, and it loops here and back again. So zooming in on that, we've got these secondary loops, and here we've got a local loop and a quarterly sentinel. So the others are done monthly as the return legs, and these are your quarterly returns. So it's quite a technical thing and requires a good understanding of the water system. It's not good enough to say, calorifier's in the basement, I'm going to the 10th floor. It's just a little bit more complicated than that.
Okay, thanks, Charles. So a little bit about response times.
Yep. Sorry about that. Yes, I haven't got that slide coming up. The other thing is, if you can't get at those loops, what you'll sometimes find is that you get a clue. You run the tap, and we'll stand there for time 60 seconds and take the hot water temperature. What we should find if the loop is flowing is that actually it responds very, very much more quickly, because it should only be coming a short distance from the flow leg. If it's taking more than about 20-30 seconds, there's a good indication that that loop is not flowing. And again, we've now got a substantial dead leg on the system, which otherwise would have been invisible, would have been unknown.
Okay, I mean, that seems quite complicated, Giles, in terms of what people are going to have to look at if they've got a large circulating hot water system, so hospitals, universities, etc. I suppose the other side of the fence is that we have got some guidance, I guess, which has been popular out there, but now is formalised in the new guidance around low-risk situations. Perhaps you could just expand on that for us.
Yeah, indeed. I've lost my slides now. Hang on. What am I doing wrong here? Yeah, these low-risk systems, there's always been this question, is it a good idea to have a central hot water system and circulate the water, or is it better to have a central, a decentralized system? Now, it's inherently safer to distribute cold water, because if the temperature goes wrong, if it reaches the ambient temperature, it's still only just in the incubating range. It's just going to warm up to 20 something, the low 20s. So cold water is inherently safer. When you want some hot water, heat it up locally. If you distribute hot water, everywhere you have it, it's susceptible to cooling, and it quite quickly gets into the incubating range, and it's got a long, long way to go in the incubating range to become, before it becomes too cool. And so it's inherently safer. And this is recognized with local water heaters, and for the guidance, they've also plumped on a 15-litre limit, saying that is a local water heater, enough throughput for it really to be fresh water all the time. And you've got these sort of guidelines in the guidance saying water usage must be constant. You must always be using this. So you've always got the throughput. The thing should be set correctly so it's hot. And if you've got all these things in place automatically, a low water volume, high turnover, no aerosol generation, guidance more or less says it's off the bottom of the scale. This is a low risk system. You need a risk assessment, you need to acknowledge it, but there isn't a great deal more to be done. In fact, at that point you say we've done the assessment, and the conclusion more or less is it's over. Just make sure that things don't change.
So, I mean, in terms of linking those two together, I mean, if you've got an electronic logbook like ZetaSafe, or indeed just paper logbooks or whatever, it looks like you're going to have to go and amend your control schemes to firstly take account of more sentinel points in, if you've got a complex circulating hot water system, and maybe you could relax things down where you've got this definition now of a low risk situation.
Yes, I think there's a change in scenery with the change in the guidance. Yes, the new definition of a sentinel point will pick up on the configuration of the system in a way that previously it wasn't. It's an example of this applying the competence, understanding the system to bring the risk down, and the same applies with the low risk systems. It's recognizing that common sense idea we've always had, that a little thing not much bigger than a kettle under the sink isn't putting life and limb at serious risk. It could grow Legionnaire if it's warm, but intuitively you can see that it is a very, very different proposition to a large system that's not working properly, which has got warm, stale water in it coming out of a shower. This is a very, very different thing, and this is now recognized. It's given us a bit more work to do in one area, and possibly a little bit less in another.
Because one of the questions we had submitted prior to the webinar was about that these are being prescribed as a risk in the commercial or business environment, but you're going to have these type of systems in the home. And we were discussing this prior to the webinar. Any advice on that, or I suppose, why is it that we might put this in approved code of practice but not worry about it so much in the home?
That's a very good question. I think there are two parts to that. I mean, the unhelpful one is the Health and Safety at Work Act, not the Health and Safety after work and before you go to work in the morning when you go home at lunchtime Act. It is the At Work Act. So the home is outside its scope. But then, of course, that is unhelpful. It only applies for the home owner. If you are renting a house, that's a business, and so there is within the definition a business, therefore there is a duty holder. So that's quite clear. But when you look at the low risk profile, quite a lot of what you're looking for, quite a lot of what defines a low risk system will be there in the home as a matter of course. It's not going to be a 15-litre water heater for the most part, but it is going to have quite a lot of throughput. You don't have, for the most part, unoccupied floors and wings and wards in your home. You have a kitchen, a bathroom, and you use the cold water and use the hot water, and you take baths, you take showers, you do the washing up, you run the washing machine. The water is, as a matter of course, maintained. Obviously, that's not always going to be the case, and maybe the fashion for ensuite bathrooms and family bathrooms and more bathrooms will surprise us in years to come and upset and disappoint us. But by and large, I think the home tends to look after itself. Although there has been some research that shows you're more likely to find Legionella in the home of somebody who's had Legionnaire's disease than on average. So there does seem to be a risk in the shadows, if you like.
Okay, but obviously in the business sense, less so to worry about in that the health and safety at work act doesn't apply.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Okay. So moving on to a final point around hot and cold water systems, which is around the important role of the schematic in all this.
Yes, this is quite interesting development. I apologize for the fuzzy image that you see there, but that's because it's old, and as you get older you get fuzzier. This is actually a scan of a photocopy of the 1987 guidance EH48, in which you can see, although it only in this case is addressing cooling tower systems, there is advice from the Health and Safety Executive to have a schematic diagram or a plan showing how the system works. And so it goes right the way back to 87, which was quite a long time ago, really. And it placed a schematic diagram as a key component. Now, over the course of time, we've had the approved code of practice. We've had HSG270 in its various editions. Finally, we've got the new ACOP, in which it's very clear a schematic diagram is an essential tool. It has gone from guidance to code of practice. So now the interpretation of the law by the Health and Safety Executive is you should have a schematic diagram. If you don't, they will take the view that you are in breach of the law because you are lacking a key control. And where it comes from, who produces it, isn't specified. It says that it shall be made available in the risk assessment process, not made available by the building owner, not made available by the risk assessor, but it will be made available in the course of the risk assessment. So there has to be one in a risk assessment. Otherwise, there's an argument that the assessment isn't complete. Now, in practice, there often isn't one, and the assessor has to make a judgment. Does he, as the British Standard suggests, abort risk assessment, say, can't do it if I don't have a schematic diagram? Or does he take a view that the best job he can do is better than no job at all, and carry out the risk assessment that he can, and point out in his report that it was hampered by the lack of a schematic diagram? Or does he prepare that schematic diagram? But essentially, without understanding how the system works, you can't really assess the risk, which, once again, logic would tell you is the case.
I mean, that presents an interesting dilemma for people. So, despite having 30 years of guidance or whatever, I would suggest there's still people out there who don't have full detailed schematics of their systems. And for me, it would seem intuitively perhaps a poor decision to walk away from assessing the risk because I don't have presented to me a component of it. Mm-hmm. So how will this practically turn out, do you think?
Well, I think there will be some discussions, there will be some arguments, but in the end, everybody must have a schematic diagram. And I think this creates a little bit of a question. Where do you start with this? I can sit here in this webinar and talk pompously about, oh yes, you must have a schematic diagram, and I can go back to 1987 and prove it. That's not very helpful when you've got a building which has been extended and modified and adapted, and its use has been changed and it's been modified again. And we started off saying, you're very good at running a business. You're not necessarily very good at running a cooling system. You may be very good at running a business. Are you very good at grasping the water system? I think the answer is, it is a job to be done. And you've got to go back to your first principles. If you remember your virtuous circle, number one is risk assess. So start off by saying, where is the risk the greatest? If you don't have a schematic diagram, how crucial is it? And start where the risk is the greatest. So if you know the new extension, for example, is a cold water system with under-sink water heaters, that's not going to be the first place you survey, or maybe the easiest, but it's not the first place you're going to survey for a schematic diagram. You're going to go into the part of the system that you don't understand, the part of the system you don't know, the part of the system that goes back to the 20s and was modified after the war and has had things added to it, because that's where the risk really is going to be. That's where your temperature control is going to be difficult. That's where your history will have led you into difficulties. That's where your showers are going to be, and that's where your risk will reside. And so I think it's a matter of rationalizing, setting priorities, saying what would I wish I had done if it all went wrong, and I would wish I had set about it in a business-like way and approached the highest risk first.
Yeah. I mean, we're nearing our time up. If anybody wants to fire in any questions via the Q&A button, please do so now quickly, and we can have a look at those. I think just finishing off on that schematic point. So obviously a cooling tower, an inherently high risk device. Mm-hmm. Would you say a risk assessment that doesn't end up containing a schematic pretty soon after, during, before a risk assessment process would pretty much be then fundamentally flawed now?
Well, I think there's a difference between your risk assessment report doesn't have to reproduce the schematic diagram. In fact, you can find yourself in difficulties doing that, because sometimes these things aren't very convenient. They may be on large sheets of paper, they may be somebody else's copyright. But if you carry out an assessment without the benefit of a diagram, you've got to make up for that. You've got to compensate for that by inspecting the whole system and satisfying yourself of how it works, and that's much more difficult. If you've got a diagram, things which aren't obvious may become more obvious. For example, there's a pipe with a lump in it, and if the schematic diagram tells you that's a non-return valve, you don't have to strip it down and find out what it is. You have to take off the legging and find out what it is. You say, well, that's a non-return valve, it makes some sense, and take it that is the non-return valve, not something else. Distinguish between a strainer and a non-return valve, for example.
Okay. We did have one question around actually schematics of, relating a couple of points we've talked about. So where you've got a complex recirculating hot water system, mm-hmm. So that I think the question, or the person who sent the question in, had a mixed aged estate, as you described it, sort of building that's been carbuncles on carbuncles over the years. And obviously in those buildings it can be difficult to understand how all the legs go. So we've got this almost double requirement to seek out new sentinels, and also possibly in doing so there's an opportunity to look at, really just starting to map out the schematic, which comes back to your where do you start? So is there an extra emphasis on people with recirculating hot water systems to really get to grips with these things that they may not have over the past 30 years of guidance?
Yes, I think so. I think you've got to recognise that such a system is inherently a higher risk than we've given credit for. There have been cases of Legionnaire's disease where the flow and return temperature seemed to be fine, but there were multiple loops on the system, and some of those loops were running cool. And so your routine checks seemed to give you a clean bill of health, and then somebody caught Legionnaire's disease. and it was because of a low flow through a system which wasn't fully understood and wasn't working properly. So I think exactly as you say, we need to look at these things and say we have to satisfy ourselves that we know how they work and that all parts of them are running hot. Or where we can't know that, and that is going to be the case in many instances, we take account of that in our controls. And we recognize we've got a risk factor, an extra.
Thanks, Giles. I think we'll probably wrap it up there. That's really interesting. So if anybody's got any questions following this, they can still fire them through, and we can answer your own personal circumstances and look at that with you. I think seems to be a summary is if you've got a cooling tower, you'll have probably had an enforcement visit or part of the enforcement campaign anyway, so you'll be reeling from the shock of that and getting to grips with it anyway. But also this key point around, if you do have recirculating hot water systems, you are going to have to look at additional sentinel points and also getting that elusive schematic done.
Yes.
As soon as possible. So we'll wrap up there. So just thank you, Giles. Thank you for your insight. And as I say, if anybody's got any questions, do email those through to Megan, Emma Hope at zetaplc.com, and we can follow those up with you.